Good evening. Really? Good evening.
Good evening.
Hey, that's better. Don't you feel better? My name is Jelani Cobb, and I'm Dean of Columbia Journalism School. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you all here today for our inaugural event launching the Newmark Center. And these are, I don't think I have to tell anyone in this room that these are critical and crucial times, not only for journalism, but for democracy. And that's why we're thrilled to be doing this work at this moment. This is why we're thrilled to be opening this center. We're thrilled to have Craig Newmark, as well as our panelists and attendees here with us to that end. So one of the things that I've said consistently to my students is that the ethics of journalism have evolved in concert with crises. That we've understood, what journalism is, what we are supposed to be, who we are supposed to serve, and how we are supposed to execute the tasks of our profession with more clarity as we have navigated various crises, particularly in this country. And so when we look at kind of how journalism ethics develop, we see questions that emerge after World War I that move into how we approach journalism and the development of ideas around objectivity and so on, and questions around World War II. Certainly questions that come out of the Cold War. We understand ourselves in a more refined way in the midst of and after Watergate. And so it's the crucial thing for us, and also kind of dealing with something that has been at the cornerstone of Columbia Journalism School since its inception, which was the serious concern that Joseph Pulitzer had specifically around the questions of ethics and journalism. And this occurs at a point at which we are increasingly confronted by questions of security, both physical security and digital security, as it relates to the field of journalism, and therefore kind of broader issues and questions of democracy. And so in that regard, we're really deeply grateful to Craig Newmark for making this center possible, for us to focus on both of those concerns, ethics and security. And we are additionally extremely grateful to our extended community here. Sorry. So I also have to say thank you to Margaret Sullivan, who is the director of the Newmark Center, and all the work that she has done thus far and her vision for moving the center forward. And so that is it for me, and I now have the distinct pleasure of welcoming Craig Newmark up himself. Thank you.
Folks, in high school, around 1970, in a really good history and civics class, we were taught that a trustworthy press is the immune system of democracy. We need trustworthy reporters asking difficult questions persistently so that we can make good decisions about things like voting. So we need some help towards that effect. Also, in times like ours, journalists come under increasing threats, both regarding, let's call it informational or online violence, as well as possibly physical violence. So we need to pay attention to that as well. I think Margaret's going to do a great job of addressing both areas here. And she's, well, much smarter than me about it. And for that matter, she's much braver about it than I am. So I'm going to stop talking and welcome her on stage.
Hi, everybody, and thanks so much for coming. We should have a really stimulating discussion here with my best friends who I've invited to be on the panel. But I want to take a minute to thank Craig Newmark for his extreme generosity to journalism, not just here, but at other institutions, including CUNY and elsewhere, and his devotion to issues beyond journalism, including cybersecurity, food insecurity, and a lot of other things that are important and that we need to care about. And he's been extremely generous. You know that he's the founder of Craigslist, and he also devotes most of his time now to Craig Newmark Philanthropies. We are grateful, and we wish there were more like you, but we are grateful for you. I am really pleased to have this panel. These were my immediate top choices, and everyone said yes, so I'm thrilled. Each person has something really good to bring to our discussion, and this is a subject that I'm pretty obsessed with, and I think maybe we all should be. So, panelists, come on up, and I will introduce you. Let's see. Oh, you're in order. You know where you're going. Okay, so closest to me here is Garrett. Oh, no, that's a lie. He's not closest to me. Farthest away from me is Garrett Graff. So Garrett is someone who's done a lot of things. He's been the top editor of Politico magazine. He's been closely associated with Wired magazine, and he's involved with Aspen Digital. But the reason that he's here today is because of his book, 2019, I think.
2021.
His
Yeah.
2021 book.
Yeah.
It's a little fact checking, right, in real time here, called Watergate, A New History. And you might not have thought that we needed a new history of Watergate, but Garrett's book is definitive and really interesting, and he has the ability to tie that important era to our current era and to kind of compare and contrast. So really thrilled to have him here. Next to him is Swathi Sharma. Swathi is the editor-in-chief and publisher
Yes.
of Vox.com, V-O-X, not F, but V. And she was my colleague at the Washington Post. Before that, she was at the Boston Globe, and she's a wonderful editor and thinker, and someone who brings a wealth of knowledge and great emotional intelligence to her work. And finally, we have Ested Herndon, who is a national politics reporter at the New York Times, and also the host of the Run-Up podcast, and is a frequent analyst, a commentator on CNN. So we have people with really different roles, and it should be cool to hear them talk about this subject that is such an important one right now. But before we do that, I just want to say quickly that I want to thank Mindy Myers and Brandon Glosser and Sarah Lally and Associate Dean Cynthia Helton for pulling this event together, and I'm really appreciative. So we'll get started. Oh, I should mention that the panel will go on for about 40 minutes, and we will go to audience questions. There's a trapdoor right near the microphone, and so if you are inclined to make a statement or a comment rather than a question, the trapdoor will open and you'll be gone. So make sure that, as Dean Cobb likes to say, that a question is a relatively brief piece of our language, and it ends in an interrogatory tone. So we'll welcome those kinds of questions. So we'll get started here, and then we will eventually go to questions, and then we will, after that, go down the hall to a reception in the beautiful World Room. So I'm supposed to Hello? Okay. So, I would like to start with you, Garrett. Garrett was my guest on my podcast called American Crisis. And in the course of it, he used the word existential crisis to describe the moment that we're in. And I guess I really want you to talk to us about, where you think we are. And I'll remind you that you mentioned that in 2 years we will be at the 250th anniversary of the founding of our country, and that we're at a very critical moment that kind of isn't necessarily going to be what you might have thought some time ago. So sort of set the scene for us. Why should we be concerned about this question right now?
Yeah, I think the answer is in the title of our session today, which is, I think our country today exists on the edge of an existential question of whether democracy survives through the end of this decade, which at the start of the last decade was not a question that I would have said was up for debate in our political culture. And
because you thought everything was on a good track.
I don't know that I would say everything I thought was on a good track, but I thought, if you go back 12 years in American politics, I think you saw parties in the country and political leaders who sort of broadly agreed upon the guardrails of democracy. And we can talk a little bit about what those are and how malleable they have turned out to be. And I am a firm believer that Donald Trump is a symptom and not the underlying disease in this slide towards authoritarianism in the United States. But I think if you go back to the presidency of George W. Bush, we had disagreements in his presidency. We had disagreements in the 2008 presidential race to replace him. But there was not a question that if John McCain won instead of Barack Obama, would we see, the fall of free elections and, sort of rise of authoritarianism in the United States. And I think that this is, despite being now something that we are 7, 8, 9 years into covering on the press, a moment where the press is still thoroughly being outclassed by the political operatives who are weaponizing this moment, and sort of still stuck with a journalistic frame and tendency that does not actually let the press talk openly and directly and starkly about the choices that we are facing as a country. Mm-hmm. I think you see it in the headlines from news organizations. I think you see it in the framing of cable news segments, and this sort of very instinctual, reactionary sort of false equivalency of both sides, where you see, both candidates are facing real electoral questions today. Donald Trump says that he will kidnap and kill Joe Biden, and Joe Biden is wearing sneakers more often than he used to. Can America, choose between these two leaders? And I think it's a real, I am sort of shocked at how little the press has actually advanced in the last 9 years of addressing this moment.
Mm. And I'd like to, I will come back to this, but it's really interesting to think about how different a moment this is than where we were with Richard Nixon and Watergate. But we'll come back to that, and thank you for setting the scene in that way. So when I was, this event has been planned for a while, but when just last week, I guess it was, we got an incredible, what we journalists call a news peg, when NBC announced that it would hire former Republican National Committee Chairwoman Ronna McDaniel. You know, it didn't go over well, and she has since been fired. I mean, hired and fired maybe is a little too simplistic, but that's basically what happened. And it's been instructive to see the differences between the journalists like Chuck Todd, like Rachel Maddow, and the bosses at NBC, and the differences in the way they have sort of presented their feelings about this. And so I turned to Swathi, who has a dual role as editor and as publisher. So you kind of straddle you're both deeply involved on the side of making sure the news organization endures as a business proposition, but also running a newsroom. And I wonder if you could comment on the NBC issue, and also just on the tensions and the problems that come up when you've got these different forces happening.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I know every week I'm like, what a crazy week in journalism news. And then it really happens every week. But this was a particularly big story. So first, on the publisher editor-in-chief role, you know, I had a lot of conversations with both of you before taking that role. And, you know, where I landed is I think it's really important for a brand to have a North Star, for something they look up to, something they think about each time. And I do believe that a business strategy and editorial rigor can go hand in hand. It is hard, but I do think it's possible. And so then when I think about what happened at NBC News, there's a couple things. I think what the owners were trying to do is they were thinking about the audience. They were thinking about, okay, let's try to we want to reach the Trump voters. They are a big part of our country. Let's bring on this person. Now, what I would challenge people to think about is, like, why is our audience, and you see this at the New York Times, you see this at a lot of publications, they think we need a diverse audience, and it always goes to Trump voters. There are many different people that I think media should be reading, non-college, people who didn't attend college. Think about the publications who are obsessed with what's happening on college campuses now. And then think about the people in this country who didn't even attend college. And I feel like so much of the coverage is trying to chase this one group of people, which is important. But I don't think the best way to reach them is bringing on elected officials. And what I would say is, I think Ronna McDaniel, she was an election denier. She had a lot of issues. Like, I think that was a really bad call. But I would also challenge NBC and cable news overall with always bringing on these, like, officials, these speech writers, the head of the RNC, all of these elected people who ran office. I mean, press secretaries. It's like, why are these folks who had a very different mission? What gives them the credentials to now, in some ways, act as journalists? So I would question that and wonder, how does this, you know, Margaret, you wrote about this, a lot of other, you know, media journalists wrote about this. What about that hire lives up to the North Star of NBC? And one thing I'll add is I think, and people may disagree with a lot of what I'm saying, but I will say I think it's very important to talk to the Ronna McDaniels and to question them and to bring in that rigor. And instead, you do this so well on your podcast where you talk to people from such different backgrounds. I think that's really important, something that everyone needs to do. But
you don't have to put her on the payroll, right?
Exactly. You don't have to do that. Yeah. That's not the way to do the journalism. And sometimes I'm like, just do journalism. And, like, you can question yourselves and think, is this the right thing to do? So,
yeah. I mean, one of the things that we heard a lot when when she was fired was, well, you know, all of you lefties don't say anything about Jen Psaki. You don't say anything about the revolving door that brings, you know, former officials onto the air as commentators. But I mean, there is sort of a big difference in that most of those people didn't actively try to overturn an election. I mean, it wasn't really the same thing, right?
It wasn't the same thing, but I think Ronna McDaniel is like far worse, but I also don't think it's bad to question that either. I don't think it's bad to think about that and think about what does give these folks their credentials. And they had such different, like a press secretary has a very different mission than someone who's now acting as a journalist. So I feel like it all should be questioned, and I think it's worth a discussion.
Stead, you want to say something here, I can tell.
It's not clear to me what Jen Psaki's doing is journalistic. Like,
Right.
I don't think that's journalism, mostly. I don't think Ronna McDaniel's doing journalism. I think the model of cable news, which I participate in, like, is not conducive to information, honestly. And so that whole panel setup isn't often journalism. And so, yeah, they're paying someone $300,000 is not because they give a further insight. Also, as someone who spends real time with Trump supporters, they don't like Ronna McDaniel. Like, it's not even actually like you're getting a viewpoint of a person that's representative of the slice. I would actually say a lot of legacy media outlets do a kind of conflation between who conservatives they want to be representative of and who they actually are, right? And so I really believe in talking to everyone. Like, the run-up has had Mike Lindell, Kellyanne Conway, Ronna McDaniel, in fact, all these folks. That's journalism. We have them for 45 minutes. We hold them accountable. We ask them real questions. We do not let them go on. We had Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on last week. He started talking about mercury in the vaccines, and we turned it down. Right? Like, we retain our editorial power to actually frame that around it. And I think you have to think proactively about the medium that you're in. So one of the reasons I wanted to do audio was because I think it lends itself to that. And so I thought that was actually harder to do in a lot of places in the traditional paper. And so that's part of me, the attraction in doing that. But I think you have to be honest with yourself. Like, are you going about a journalistic enterprise? Like, and if that answer is no, then Ronna McDaniel gets the better end of that deal, right? But that's true in a lot of places. So, you know, the thing I'm itching is like, I do think Ronna McDaniel and Jen Psaki are not the same. But I do think the model of cable news should be questioned broadly.
But it's so easy, isn't it, to, instead of doing reporting, to have people sitting around talking. It's cheap.
Totally.
It's easy. You know, you pay people and they blather, and I mean, you do not blather.
I mean, I definitely blather. I also think though, like, they've changed though, even in the Trump time, even in the 6 to 8 years. There's way less journalists as people on the panels with. I'm increasingly by myself in terms of journalism. And they'll have a Trump person on one side or a person supposed to give a liberal perspective on the other side. But there used to be a lot more active reporting on those shows. And they've stepped away from that too. So, I mean, I think that like there is but when you look at Fox, right, they talk about Democrats without them being there. And when this Ronna stuff was happening, I asked a friend at NBC, who's the most Republican voice? Who is the Republican voice? Does that matter? And their answer was Michael Steele. Like, Michael Steele hasn't been a real member of the Republican Party for a long time. So you can say that that's not valuable, but don't say that they're there, because they're not.
So I think, you know, one of the reasons that many people are here is because you work for the New York Times. And there's great interest, there's great interest in how the Times does things because it's so influential. It's not necessarily that everybody reads the Times. It's not that everybody believes what's in the Times, but the Times is so much a leader in terms of what the rest of the media does. And so when we hear this criticism, which I think is a valid one that Garrett made and that I have made, that the mainstream media normalizes Trump and equates things that aren't equal. Some of that comes from the Times, I think. And so, you know, I guess I just, you know, I wonder if you would talk to us about why that is. I mean, it doesn't seem to reflect what Swathi was talking about, this sort of North Star of the truth. It seems to reflect a desire not to offend somehow. So what is it that the bosses are, what is the philosophy that's producing this?
Yeah, this is a hard thing to do. I think that like, I mean, I was thinking about this. One, I don't feel the need to defend journalism, media broadly, or any place all the time, right? Like I'm black. Like I know, with journalists, Dean Baquet used to talk about how the Times missed the Great Migration, and how and so places have always existed. Journalism has always existed as a vehicle to expose and to not. And I think a lot of places have been dealing with that struggle. And I totally think the Times and legacy media broadly had a real challenge with that with Trump. And so I was just like everybody else in 2016. I was working at the Boston Globe at the time, thinking, what are these people doing? And I remember going to my first Trump rally.
What people doing?
All the journalists I saw,
Oh.
not just at the Times, but on cable news, playing the rallies unfiltered. I remember going to my first Trump rally in New Hampshire, and it was so hard. I remember I had all these ideas about how I would do this differently, how I would write, how I would fact check everything, how I would do and that's not a story. And there was the deadline pressure. So I'm saying it's actually a difficult thing, but I do think there's been a lot of reflection about how we cover them. I would point to our Trump 2025 stuff about stakes that I think was some of the best stuff about what Donald Trump's words actually are. I think the run-up is very good. And I would say that it's a feature of the New York Times.
Yeah.
That that's not happening outside of the building, that's happening in the building. I would say
You can subscribe now wherever you get your podcast.
yeah, but I'm not just saying that in a self-promotion way. I'm saying to the exact question we are talking about here. Who has talked to these people more directly than us? Who's gone to more Trump rallies than us?
So do you think the coverage is good?
So I think the coverage is fine. Frankly, I think the coverage is pretty good. I think that I think cable news is bad mostly, and I think actually when we think about the people most. When I would say when I think about democracy, I think about Sinclair owning all local TV stations. Mm-hmm. I think about the ways tech companies have stepped back from being and has let misinformation fly. And I think that the focus on New York Times is partly a reflection of a hollowed out media ecosystem where we take up too much space at the top currently. Mm-hmm. And so I think some of these fights I don't care about. And I think I care about them in the building, and I care about trying to make that journalism better. And I have frankly found them to be receptive to that when that argument is made to them.
You mean the decision makers?
Yes. And so I don't think that's 100% hit rate, but I would ask who does. And frankly, I think it's better than pre-2016. And I'm proud of that, honestly. I think when January 6th happened, we had a run of stories in the paper about how violence was possible because of white grievance. Who else did that? I'm saying we've actually, and so I think there's actually been a change in the type of political reporting there. And I think I'm proud of that.
Okay.
So I think, to me, what's interesting about the Times, and I'm not setting you up here to defend the whole institution.
We are, though.
I think I did.
that to me, the challenge that the Times faces is indicative of, I think, a lot of the institutional challenges of sort of corporate media, where there's a disconnect to me inside the Times between the quality of the reporting that the reporters are doing at the Times and the quality of the thinking that the editors are doing into packaging and sort of shaping that news product. Let me give you sort of two examples. There is no one who has done better reporting on the corruption of Fox News than the New York Times. The reporting that it has done around the Dominion lawsuits, around the sort of the Fox's adoption of the big lie, sort of et cetera, et cetera. The New York Times still will not call Fox News right-wing in its news product, and sort of will still sort of list it in the same list of Fox, CNN, and MSNBC. Similarly, there's no one who has done better reporting on Tucker Carlson's adoption of sort of authoritarianism light and white nationalist opinions than the New York Times. And the New York Times, in the news product, won't call Tucker Carlson a white nationalist. And there's sort of this.
What do you think would happen if we did? What happens? What happens next?
I think, to me, we need to be better as journalists about calling things what they are. And that.
Like the whole debate earlier on about lie.
Yeah.
Was something a lie, or was it merely a false claim?
Right. That the difference between sort of accusations versus lies, or that to me, like this moment calls for a moral clarity and a language clarity that I think institutional news organizations are still really struggling with, even when their own reporting backs up stronger language than the editors are willing to accept.
Yeah, I wouldn't fully disagree with that. I feel about that about editors broadly. But the thing I would say is, no offense, the things I would say specifically to that is I think it calls for reporting clarity, right? And I remember doing so many stories and about the grievance ones that we were just talking about. Not using the word racist, right? That was a huge discussion at the time. Mm-hmm. And no stories basically never used the word racist. No one misses it, though. I don't miss it. Because you actually went there and you proved something in the reporting clarity sense that you actually don't have to make that thing. The fact that you can separate the Tucker Carlson reporting as valuable, to me means what would you lose if you then added the label? It's not inherent. I think there's a fair argument to say it. But I think we should also acknowledge that it's not the only way to communicate information. And if you frame and report, you get to the point, and they'll get it, just like you got it. And so I'm saying, that's our task to live up to consistently. And we don't always. But I actually think if you do that well, the word debate to me is exhausting. I'm not concerned about calling them something. I'm concerned about proving something. And frankly, calling someone something sometimes distracts from your ability to prove it. And so, are we doing the journalism is the question I ask myself, right? And I think it's the question I think others should ask of us too. I think that's a fair thing to put on them. But I guess so I'm just saying, I think the clarity, it does matter. I think it's clarity in reporting.
Okay. That's a good point. Yesterday on Meet the Press, Kristen Welker described Donald Trump's attacks, verbal attacks on a judge's family and other rhetoric as, quote, a reminder that we are covering this election against the backdrop of a deeply divided nation. Now that is true, and that's something you hear a lot, but it doesn't actually get the point across very well. I mean, this idea that, we're polarized and we're divided, and an author who I like a lot, who's written about authoritarianism, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, said, this is totally insufficient to the gravity and magnitude of the threat. And I think that's part of what we're trying to talk about here is, while it's true we're deeply divided and polarized, that seems like such an easy out. So I don't know, Swati, I guess I'm asking if you would reflect on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think the audience you're trying to approach, you're trying to reach, that really does matter in these conversations, because you need to write with clarity and approachability. I mean, that's obviously, I'm speaking Vox language because we write and audio and video, we have explainers and we explain complicated things, but I do think saying the thing and explaining it and reaching people who, my cousins who live in the suburbs of Seattle do not know what a polarized and divided nation, what are you talking about, right? They really do want to understand what all of these things mean. Their questions, they are wondering if Biden's too old, and I do think that's worth exploring. It's also worth exploring what the stakes are. And I think that's one thing I think about always is how do you really get that precise question answered, and how do you do it in a very approachable way, not speaking more of the DC, New York language, but really, really making sure people understand what's at stake and what's happening. And I do
think that is, you're so right, that expression of hers is the sort of way that, you know, DC journalists will try to approach this subject in a way that isn't too scary and isn't going to get them in trouble, but still kind of touches on what the problem is.
Right. One of the things that really annoys me is when it's like, here's a really horrible plan someone has. Critics say it's bad. You know, it's like,
it's just bad.
It's just bad. It's okay to say that. I do think you have to do the reporting though. And I think you have to show people the reporting sometimes. And I think then you can say it. I do have sometimes an issue with super hot takes, because sometimes I think people don't do the work to show you what's actually happening and, again, what's at stake. And I think even the smallest moments should connect to something bigger so people can understand like why this matters, why it's important. And I do think like one thing all journalists can do is challenge themselves, and those things like critics say, those kinds of the two sidesism, I think we have gotten better, but I still think there's a long way to go. And again, it just comes down to like doing really good journalism.
And there is a long way to go, and we don't have a lot of time, it seems to me. So, Garrett, I cannot have you on this panel without asking you to at least draw the sort of broad outline of the difference between 50 years ago, when Watergate was happening, a democratic crisis, I think you could say, and now, and not at great length, but just to sort of draw that out for us a bit.
Yeah, I mean, what stands out when you go back and look at the media environment of Watergate is how undiverse and unified the media landscape actually was. You know, everyone in the country, not exactly everyone, but you know, huge numbers of people sat down and watched the evening news. People got their morning newspaper, they got their afternoon newspaper, they got their Time, their Newsweek, and there was a lot to criticize about what that, sort of how undiverse that news moment was, but there was a real opportunity for unified conversation because people were getting the same set of facts. They were getting primarily facts, not opinion. And there were places where the opinion existed, but that it was primarily coming to them from people like Walter Cronkite. It was primarily coming to them from the front pages of the New York Times or the Washington Post or Time or Newsweek. To me, one of the things, and you and I talked about this, is, I'm of the very firm opinion Richard Nixon survives if Fox exists. That one of the biggest changes from then to now is you did not have the sort of level of allegation throwing and muckraking against Nixon's political opponents that you would now expect in today's far more fractured media environment. You would both have, sort of the Fox News bubble protecting
a refuge.
Protecting Richard Nixon and his party. But then you would also see, the tearing down of Archibald Cox and Pete Rodino and,
Howard Baker.
Sort of the people who were investigating Richard Nixon at the time, in the same way that we are sort of now used to seeing, the Robert Muellers and Jack Smiths and the Letitia Jameses and the Fannie Wills, sort of torn down by the President Trump's supporters.
We are going to go to actual audience questions pretty soon. So I think, given where we are in part two here of our conversation, I'll do a little bit of a lightning round with our panelists and ask you to address, doesn't need to be in a sentence, but pretty briefly, the question of whether you think the press is up to the task. I think we're all in agreement. I hope we're all in agreement that we do have a democracy problem, and ask you if the press is up to the task. And I'm going to start with you, Ested.
I think it's hard. I think that the levels of distrust in institutions are so deep that what is happening in media is only reflective of that. And I think this election is different. I think we've learned some 2016 lessons, but I think we have a new problem. And it's much more of an active rejection of a system than it is a ignorant kind of lack of understanding. Mm-hmm. And so I actually think we'll do better at the stakes this time. I think we'll do better at impacts. I think we're dealing with a public that cares less.
What is the, just to follow up a little bit, what is the problem that we have now? I mean, you said that, you know, we had an initial problem in 2016, which was a sort of ignorance problem. What is the key issue now, or the key problem?
Well, I can say what I run into on the road, and this is not only election people are actively, not tuned out, but actively ignoring information.
Pushing it away.
Pushing it away. And I think that's reflective of candidates. I think that's reflective of political system folks are increasingly distrustful of. I think that's reflective of international conflict and so I think we call it apathy, but that's not apathy. It's rejection. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's what we're up against in a way that I think even us doing better does not solve that. I think doing better, we will present something better to, I think, people who are less interested in hearing it. And so I hope that changes. And I think with good work and with work that is spoken in people's voice, that does all the things we're talking about, I do think you can overcome that. But I think it's hard, and I think it's harder now.
Thank you. Swathi.
Yeah, I do think it's hard. I am someone who needs hope and needs to believe that we can do it. I will say, everything Ested said, I totally agree with. What I'll add is, I do think there are people out there who there is that rejection of a lot of facts, there is rejection of the systems, but there are people who really aren't fully tuned in and do want to understand. Mm-hmm. And I do think a lot of the publications we talk about, there is a certain level of, if you read the New York Times, which is wonderful, you do need a certain level of knowledge to be able to read it, to consume it. And I really, really hope that we can all make a lot of efforts in making sure that we're reaching all of the people instead of just thinking of conservatives versus liberals, lefties versus, patriots. Like, there are a lot of different types of people, and especially people of color. Again, people who didn't graduate college. And I feel like there isn't as much that isn't like a focus for people to let's reach them. And that's, I think, Vox is trying to do that, and I know other publications, The Guardian is as well. I think that, and I think the New York Times is as well, but that I think can be a central push for a lot of people, because I think the audience you're trying to reach matters, and if you can have that be a targeted approach on really thinking about who you're trying to reach, I think there is some difference that the media can make.
And Garrett.
Yeah. To me, part of this challenge, this is sort of picking up comments made by both of my fellow panelists here, that this is coming at a time when media itself is very much trying to figure out how to fund its own work. And that is, we haven't really talked that much about the sort of business side of this, but that is a big part of the backdrop of a lot of the reporting challenges and institutional and corporate challenges that we are seeing. That when we talk about the golden age of American journalism, which we sort of collectively in the media mythologize as starting sometime maybe in the 1950s and going up till generally 2 years before any of us joined the media. That's sort of generally the one thing journalists all agree on is the good times ended 2 years before you started in journalism. But what you saw in that moment was very high quality information being delivered equally to wealthy readers and low income and low education readers. That your local newspaper was being incredibly highly subsidized by mattress companies, car dealerships, grocery stores, and department stores that were effectively funding foreign correspondents in order to encourage you to look at their Memorial Day sales ads. And that one of the big information divides I really worry a lot about in journalism today is wealthy people have more access to better information than anyone has ever had before. That, you know, the wealthy readers of Bloomberg, you know, have more information available to them than the President of the United States did in 1972. And that what I think is disappearing is sort of everything below that in the spectrum of American media.
It's kind of common ground where everybody has a sort of basis that they agree on of some sort of reality. Although I think we would all agree that and you said it to begin with, it was a very non-diverse point of view.
Yes.
You know, it was Walter Cronkite, and it was the New York Times, and it was your local newspaper, and it was pretty much a bunch of white guys, and you know, we all believed what they said. I mean, there was a gatekeeper.
And it was a very
over.
diverse time. I mean, you had white male newspaper editors from Harvard and from Yale and Columbia.
Yes.
And so, you know, you had almost the whole spectrum
Right.
represented in, you know, newspaper editors.
Yes, exactly. Let's go to some questions. I know we have students in the room. I know we have journalists in the room, and it would be great to hear from some of you. So, you know, you don't have to line up at the mic, but you go ahead. I'm sorry. Oh, hang on one second because we are recording. So, actually, could you come up to the microphone? Let's let this gentleman ask his question, and then this is great.
Hi, good morning. Got a problem with the thing I call booby trap journalism. You get the thing with the race card that's always get pulled out. That DeSantis and Nikki Haley was running for the president nomination. They automatically threw the race question out there. Was this country racist? They didn't know how to answer it. Why do we always fall for that? What's going on with that? The booby trap journalism. Who comes up with that? The networks?
You're talking about this kind of gotcha
Yeah,
thing?
we always fall for that. The race, was America racist? Is America a racist country was the question. And automatically you can just see all the voters ran toward Trump when Nikki Haley and DeSantis was running for, you know, the candidacy. Why do we always fall for that? Why is it, what's the goal?
Anybody want to take that on?
I mean, I do think if you're a politician, those questions do come up and you do kind of have to figure out how to answer them. That specific question, I do think there's merit to it, and I think that someone who really has been thinking about it, there is a lot that you can say on the topic. So I don't know what the intention is behind the question, if it's booby trapping or asking tough questions of people who could be our future leaders. But
There is a lot of racism in America, and it does deserve to be explored.
Yeah.
And it is a driving force, I would suggest.
Exactly.
So.
Hi. Mr. Graff, if I heard correctly, I believe you said early on that you don't think the media has really progressed as much as it should have over the last, 12 years or so. And I think you disagree with Mr. Herndon on that. What specific things should the media do now to deal with a person like Trump who is threatening a judge's family?
I don't think we're necessarily that far apart. I think we're a lot better than we were in 2016. We're better than we were in 2024 or 2020. To me, part of the challenge is we don't have a lot of time left. And like, we don't have 3 more presidential election cycles to get these questions right in the media. And I think we need to be sort of acting more decisively as journalists, in thinking about the frames that we use, in thinking about the headlines that get written. Like, to me, actually, a lot of this challenge is not as I've said, is not the underlying reporting, it's the way that the stories get framed and the way that the headlines get written. That I sort of often, open up news headlines and it sort of feels like the people who write headlines in newsrooms have not lived through the same, last 8 or 10 years that I think the reporters in their newsrooms have lived through. And to sort of Margaret's point, that I think there's an imprecision in the frame that we're sort of used to trying to bring things down to the same level, sort of have this equivalency between both sides. And they are, to me, not equivalent because the underlying causes and disagreements are not the same. That, you look at, political reporting about, AOC, Bernie Sanders, and Chuck Schumer have, real policy disagreements about the precise, Medicare repayment equation that Democrats should be using in the push for, all-payer healthcare, whatever. And then it's like, and Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene believe that Mike Johnson should be shot for treason. There's infighting on both sides in sort of this way that just feels to me very forced, in a way that does not do a service to explaining the stakes to the readers.
So are you saying they shouldn't cover the AOC Medicaid issue, or just downplay it completely and give big headlines to the Matt Gaetz story?
No, it's not that you don't cover it. It's that you don't sort of
Step back and equate it.
Yeah, you don't equate the two as the same.
Yeah.
Thank you.
In my opinion, like a lot of where both sides of them has a root in DC, where it is necessary often for reporters who are engulfed in that ecosystem to portray the sides as equal, or because the place runs on that. Like, part of the reason I like elections and not Capitol Hill is because it gets you freedom out of that. And when you talk to what's the biggest reason why that sentence happens? In my opinion, it's because people can't mess with their relationships with Republicans. They can't mess with their relationships with Democrats. The whole place runs on that kind of horse trading access and information. And so I think there is a root cause problem with the way information is traded and what we prioritize, specifically coming from DC, that does not translate to elections and how people come to it. And so that's why I think it's really important to switch the framing, because when we're talking about the Meet the Presses, the MB, that's still that world. But when we talk about elections, how people are coming to it, that's when it feels so incongruous, because that's not how people are thinking about it. So I like flipping that framing, and I think the reason why we get so much both sides of them is there because they have a personal and professional investment in that, because the place runs on that.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Hi.
In her response to the State of the Union address, Senator Britt told a story, related an anecdote that on second examination was profoundly distorted. I could use that euphemism. But that story was broken within 24 hours by an independent journalist which was then picked up by, all the major publications. Why do you think that it wasn't understood or analyzed by any of the mainstream press?
I mean, one of the things we have going on now, which is a positive thing, is that there are a lot of voices out there, and there are a lot of, I mean, I understand your question. Why did it have to come from a small, independent journalist, and why couldn't it have been fact-checked or brought out by NBC or the New York Times or the Washington Post? And I actually don't know that that's the case. But to address your point, but I think that, one of the bright points of what we have going on now is that there are people who have a voice on social media. They have the ability to take their work and put it out and have it picked up. And that was not the case in the 1970s. So, and at the same time, I think your point is there's not much energy or desire to dig underneath. And, that is a problem.
I would also say there was this sense that the guy who broke that story, Jonathan Katz, was like some random guy on TikTok.
Yeah, that's not the case.
He is, in fact, an incredible reporter, great writer, worked for the Associated Press in Haiti for a number of years. When I was editor at Politico magazine, we sent him to Haiti for an extended piece to investigate the work of the Clinton Foundation there. Like this is not some like random dude on TikTok. This was like a real top of the line journalist.
Blogger in the basement.
You were complimenting him, so I'm not saying, but like he is a real dude who does real investigative work.
And I see there's a lineup of people, so I don't want to hog the microphone. But that's putting a burden on a consumer of news, which I am. I'm not a journalist. I'm married to a journalist, but it's not quite the same thing.
I'm sorry.
No, he was able to hold on to his profession until, he made a transition. But it's, yes, I when I dug into who he was and I looked at his background, but, the benefit of having something like the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Boston Globe or Vox, or Politico, is that
you don't have to do that work.
It's an impromptu. How much can an average reader, swim through the ocean of all these different people who are out there on the internet?
Well, all the publications you mentioned did then cover it and did address it. And I am glad that Jonathan Katz did uncover it. I don't know, maybe other publications would have, but in the end, if you do consume one of those others, you still would have come across that information. And to me, it highlights like the need for really good journalism. And I totally believe what you just said. Like, I believe we should all look at Katz and try to be like him and think about that and learn from that. But I don't think it's. I think it's still like a net positive for journalism.
As a politics-wise, if we did that on most politician stories, we would find most of them to be false, right? Like, we don't do that work often. Right. And I think that is a problem. And when you mention the investigative, I think oftentimes we think of like, political reporting doesn't have, not everyone gets into political reporting to dig, And so I do think we could use more of a not just a skeptical lens, but the kind of journalistic accountability that we do in other desks and other kind of ways, specifically politics. But the assumption is that these folks are lying. And so often they get away with lying, right? Because that follow-up is not happening.
Can I just ask really quickly, we have a time constraint if everybody asks one question, and that confines it to 30 seconds in the framing.
So I loved your podcast, Margaret, and today's discussion. But as an outsider, I wonder if we're being naive in thinking that journalism can actually save democracy, and worry that between the hunger for clicks and the desire to not be accused of bias, the press is actually making things worse. And I'm wondering how we get out of the both sides issue that Astrid just mentioned and the need for revenue. And my question is whether there's an inherent catch-22 where outlets like the New York Times and other credible outlets are under so much pressure to look fair that they put too much focus on things like Hillary's emails or Biden's age, or they get criticized and rejected for being one side.
Well, that's a great question. You've really summed up a lot of the issues.
I'm worried about the trapdoor.
No, there's not for you. No trapdoor. I mean, the conclusion of my podcast, which asked the question, can journalism save democracy, was not all by itself. But I do think it's very important that we have it and that it be good and that it get past some of the issues that you're talking about. But no, it can't. It cannot save democracy. It can serve a purpose in democracy. I mean, the things that you've brought up, I don't think any of us can sort of, resolve at this moment. Mm-hmm. Unless anybody thinks they can. I mean, have at it.
I'll just say, I don't think the reason some journalists, why they resort to the two-sidesism isn't for revenue. I think those are two different things.
Oh, yeah,
I do
clearly.
think the revenue issue is a real issue in journalism, and we're all trying to solve it. On the other end, there is the two-sidesism is kind of just what Estelle says. It is such a creature of journalism for so many reasons, and I think we're all trying to challenge that.
And one thing we haven't mentioned, and maybe this is convenient for me to say, but like post midterms, there was an assumption that Trump was done. And I think press did not cover it enough, did not cover the early stage of his presidential campaign enough. We were alone at these events. Because frankly, I think a lot of people ingested that it was better to not talk about it and that there was somehow a benefit in that. And I think a lot of public is frankly very surprised at Trump's endemic lasting appeal of Republicans, that he's the nominee again, but that was always the most likely outcome. And I think we actually did not. So I don't think, to me the choice isn't cover, not cover. It is in what you're doing and how you're doing it. And I actually think that we can get so over the skis in that fear of offense that sometimes that comes out in both sidesism, but sometimes that comes out in not. The reporting clarity that we need also has to include conservatives. And I don't think we do some of that. I think we dropped the ball on that, particularly after the midterms, because I think there was a sense, kind of like his Twitter going away. I just think there was a sense that like you could wish it away. And I think that was a disservice too.
Thank you.
Well, to protect democracy, I guess we require fearless journalism, also ideological free journalism. So the example I'd like to give is the original COVID. The New York Times and to a lesser extent Vox and Politico don't cover it properly. 4 years ago, when lab leak theory was mentioned, it was labeled as a racist conspiracy by New York Times health science reporter on Twitter. So just because the right-wing people mentions lab leak you don't need to label people immediately as a racist and conspiracist. Now that after a few years, black and white document from NIH, US Department saying most likely lab leak, US money went to Wuhan, both Chinese scientists and American scientists were partially responsible in generating viruses that gave us COVID, that we can even meet in person for 4 years. What happened to fearless journalism? If you don't have that, you're not going to protect democracy. It doesn't matter whether you like Fauci or don't like Fauci, like Trump or don't like Trump. It shouldn't matter at all in how you cover a particular topic.
What is your?
My question is, what happened to the fearless journalism? What happened to the coverage for the 4 years regarding COVID origin? I use that as an example in how you cover
I think
other
that was a
topics.
mistake.
But I also think journalists make mistakes, and they should say that they made mistakes.
Yeah.
And Vox did that, and I think other publications
I saw that.
did too.
I appreciate that, but New York Times have not.
Listen, I can direct you to the questions inbox, but I'm saying, in my personal opinion, I do think that there was fear around COVID origin reporting, and I do think that in hindsight that is clearer.
Thank you. I hope that really helped people. Just simple acknowledgement, say we messed up. And help a lot of
what I have control over on our show,
Yeah.
I think that transparency is really important. I do think that people come to it more directly, even when they don't agree with what you're saying or where you go or if you mess up, whatever. Being forthright about it is most helpful.
Thank you.
Mr. Newmark, thank you. James Medor with Newsday. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the economic difference we see from the Watergate years, and the institutions you mentioned are considerably weaker today in terms of resources, and most journalistic institutions that were around then are weaker today. How does that affect democracy?
I mean,
No one's showing up for school board meetings. I mean, the way that this is reflected across the country is in the day-to-day basic journalism does not get done anymore. There are not reporters to cover school board meetings, city council meetings, state legislatures. You know, I don't know what the exact number is, but the number of local reporters in Washington who cover their home state congressional delegations is like single digits now. And you see, you know, in Washington, reporting is way over-rotated on covering politics and under-rotated on covering government. You know, the number of reporters that cover the Department of Homeland Security, the third largest cabinet department, it's a half dozen to a dozen fully assigned to that beat, and most of them also simultaneously cover the Justice Department. You know, you know, one of the things, most of my background as a reporter is covering federal law enforcement. One of the things that has gone largely unnoticed is as the number of journalists across the country has dwindled in the last 15 years, the FBI has transferred more agents to public corruption squads across the country because the local government, state government, is getting more corrupt than it has been during the period when journalists actually showed up to cover those day-to-day meetings.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Adelina, and I'm a PhD student here, and I've spent the last couple of weeks interviewing I study college journalism, interviewing college students about what the work that they do. A lot of it is that local reporting, right, where they are at school board meetings or they are covering the State House, albeit from a student perspective. And so I've been asking them what they think journalism should be, what they hope it should be. So kind of like on behalf of them, I'd like to ask you, what is something, and don't feel the need to repeat yourself if it overlaps with previous questions, but what is something that you would say to those students who will be doing the work, in some cases in a couple of months after they graduate, in terms of their role and the role of journalism in upholding democracy?
So why don't we do a quick answer to that down the line here. So I guess, Swathi, I kind of prepared you for that question. So, you know, what do you think young journalists should be keeping in mind?
Yeah, well, one thing, I think young journalists should, if possible, try to still work at local newspapers. I feel like often when I talk to student journalists, some of them are trying to come to Vox, and I'm like, that's great. And, you know, please, but I think it is still valuable to work in local publications. I mean, you know, I think we both came from the Boston Globe, and I think that makes a big difference. I also think one piece of advice I give anyone who asks me for advice, what I say is, it's really important to have a mission that you believe in, and that makes your life so much easier. A personal thesis that kind of guides you through all the tricky times. So for me, I believe that ignorance is the root of a lot of problems in society, and information can help it. And that was something I cared about when I was like 12 years old, and that hasn't changed, and kind of worked for journalism, and makes a lot of sense given how my career has panned out so far. So that's some advice I would give, but local journalism is still there, and a place that is still looking for really strong journalists.
So just real quick, you know, Garrett and Ested on that question.
I'll steal Ested's line. Assume people are lying to you. That if more journalists assumed in more of their conversations that they were being actively misled, journalism would be better for it.
It is April Fool's Day, after all.
Yeah, I mean, I think a legitimate curiosity. Like, it cannot be performed. It can't be, you will be worse, you know? And the job is too hard to not have it. I'm like, do you actually care? And I find that to be something that is really clarifying. I would really agree with Swathi's point about where you are. I mean, coming out of school, it was so important. I think good journalism isn't in a bubble, and I think college is inherently one. And I just had to grow as a person and like be in situations and be willing to put myself in situations that would force that growth. And I think that is a thing you have to want. And I think a good journalist will. So I would say, like, There was a lot I didn't know too. I'm saying like, know what you don't know, like take help. But keep the fresh eyes. Like, I benefited so much from being 23 for when Trump was elected and getting moved to DC. Because a whole bunch of people were stuck on rules. I had no clue what they were. And it allowed me, I think, to see the situation a lot more clearly and be guided by that. And so you can have those instincts even as you learn from people who know more about the actual profession.
Thank you. We've got about 10 more minutes.
Thank you for being there.
so-
Thank you for the presentation. My question is that we have everything he says, all his rhetoric and all his throwing things out. Did you ever ask him one-on-one to sit down in person and write what he says and ask him to explain that to you before he says it, puts it out?
Talking about Donald Trump?
Well, the president wants to be the president nominee. Did you ever ask him, go on an interview and ask him, listen, Mr. Explain what you, on paper, does he speak what he writes or writes what he speaks? Did you ever ask him to clarify himself on paper and ask him?
I think I understand what you're saying. I have asked any person who would listen to me to clarify what they mean. And so I would do so no matter who's in front of me. So I don't know if that's always happened in written form, but I have asked Donald Trump to do that. I've asked Joe Biden to do that. We can go all the way down the list.
Well, he's on the public venue. Have you ever asked him to sit down with you one-on-one, write it on a piece of paper what you mean? Ask, was he speak what he writes or writes what he speaks?
If I ever get time with him, I will think about that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Again, thank you as well. As you mentioned, resources, it's really hard. Journalists can't be in every community. Time is short from now to polling day. So I just wondered in some instances as a way that journalists can collaborate, as well as, of course, they're always competing. But it will be Democracy Day in September, yes, as I understand it, and journalists are at the fore of that, collaborating on that. What I wondered could be really useful, and it's a factual 3 questions, that could go out to every candidate who is running for Congress this time round, and just simply, and you want it back in writing, 2020 was an election that President Biden won. That 2020 fact was conclusive that President Biden was legitimately elected president. And for 2024, will the candidate also, with the usual due process for anyone going for election, if it's close, if there are concerns, you have the right to have that all proceed, but at the end also accept the result and the peaceful transfer of power. And I just think that as on a voter guide, whether it's every newspaper, the website for broadcasters, and it's a very specific question, because otherwise, as you say, in television, weekly on Sundays, we either have them go, well, okay, it's president, but there are a lot of problems with 2020, and it moves on. And it's said over and over as much as the big lie is. So I think just 3 big facts, and come Democracy Day, that gives from now to Democracy Day, plenty of time for every candidate to be able to answer that simple question. And then
Is
that's
there,
just,
I hear the
question is,
idea
could
you're
that be
presenting,
done?
but is there a question here?
Yes, I'm saying could that be done? Because I think then for voters, it doesn't take up their time. They can very quickly see if this candidate, do they accept the election last time, and will they accept it after all the due process next time?
All right, well,
We
you've
don't-
got
that's
some,
the
you've got some
question.
media leaders here, so I'm sure they'll take it under advisement.
I think, and Swati sort of made this point a little bit earlier, I think part of the challenge there is that assumes that the people supporting the candidates who are backing the big lie, that's a bug, not a feature of their candidacy.
Yeah.
The core ideology of the Republican Party is that there is no legitimate victory that could result in a Democratic candidate winning. And that is a huge change in our politics in the last 20 years. And like that is, I think the challenge of those questions sort of presuppose that there is some sort of vast undecided chunk of the American population who are, like really actively trying to choose between, do I want the white nationalist authoritarians or do I want Joe Biden? And I just don't think that that voter actually exists in America anymore.
Okay.
You had mentioned that the way that the press, the way that the media has been covering the election and politics in 2016 versus 2020 versus how it's covering it right now has been different. I guess my question is, what are the specific editorial decisions that have been made to cover this election, to cover politics specifically differently? And how do you measure progress in whether you're going closer to the mission that you've created for yourself as a newsroom or...
Well, here I'm going to turn to Swathi because she is the leader of a newsroom in Washington, D.C. So, what is your process with staff? How do you lay out your philosophy or your, how do you deal with that? Is it a conversation? Is it a statement? Is it marching orders? How do you get it across?
It's a lot of conversations, it's a lot of listening, and it's a lot of taking risks and challenging ourselves. Some ways we were trained was to always say, critics say. And, with this new challenge of Donald Trump, we have really had to challenge ourselves, and I'm really, I'm not grateful for the democracy challenge we have, but I'm grateful that we're all challenging ourselves to be better journalists. And I do think, you said this before, I do think that journalism did have to challenge itself and grow and really think about, again, who is the audience we're serving. And the changes that we've made over time is, again, putting the audience front and center. And I don't mean clickbait. I mean, how are you actually serving people? And people who aren't in the media bubble. I think one thing I love about Vox is there are very few publications who are reaching people inside the bubble and outside. And you always have to challenge yourself and change. So if we did get something wrong, we are very open about publishing a story saying we got something wrong. And those are the things that are building trust and building that relationship with our audience. But I do think the biggest thing, we're going to change from now to the election day, and we're going to change after that, but we're constantly ready to change. And I think that is something that all newsrooms should do more and be open to evolving.
Yeah, I remember when I was interviewing at the Times, and I said really explicitly, if you want to write the same stories you've always written, I'm not it. There's a line of people, and there is openness to that. And so I know that exists because it's my experience. And I think that 2016 provided an exposing of a mass disconnect between political journalism industry that clearly did not know the country, right? And every portion of that election, from the 2016 primary on the Democratic side, certainly the 2016 Republican primary, and the general election, was, I would say, a baseline failure of understanding the country. I think that provided a lot of space in 2016 and 2020 that people like myself probably walked in through. I don't think without that I would be in political journalism. I don't know, right? But there was an openness to writing different types of stories and a clarity around those type of stories that I do think is real. Now, the question about how you hold yourself to continuing that is really real too. For me, that's what audio did, is I felt that I can be more authentic to that belief, or most authentic to that belief, in a space where I have more editorial control and in a medium that lends itself to nuance. And that's why I did it. And so I do think you have to keep checking in on yourself, because it can get further and further away from mission. And if you're trying to do something that's different, you can either change every place or you can find a space. And I think that I could say at the Times has been, it's not everyone's experience, that encouraging of me finding that space and then owning who they are, right? I'm not like a not transparent person, right? And so I think if it was as rigid as I think people think, I don't know I would be there. I wouldn't.
So thank you. We have 3 people at the microphone and about 5 minutes. So I'm going to do something, borrow something that I've seen Jelani Cobb do, which is everybody ask their question. We're not going to have any answers until the questions are asked, and we'll see what we can address. So please ask a question, and then we'll go to the next person, just so everybody gets to. Well, somebody's bailed, so so take your time. No, go ahead.
I do have a question. So, how do you think that the deliberate pollution of the information landscape is impacting the safety of journalists? And what should newsrooms be doing to ensure that their reporters and the other staff who work there are not sort of intimidated or bullied into self-censorship or having to change how they do what they do in terms of the ways of integrity that you've been discussing?
Okay, thank you. And go ahead.
Thank you. When you look at the juxtaposition of Jem Psaki getting hired at MSNBC versus Ronna McDaniel, right? Jem Psaki, obviously the former press secretary, Ronna McDaniel, who was the head of the RNC, and then MSNBC retracting their offer to her because of complaints from employees. I'm curious what you guys think about the incentive structure. Are these news corporations sincerely interested in a diversity of viewpoints within their halls, or is the incentive structure more about towing the line to make sure that you're part of your news corporation's narrative? So that's my question.
So these are really very disparate questions. So anybody want to take on how you're dealing with sort of bullying, disinformation, and the all of that?
Yeah, I can take that on. It is terrifying and frightening to see what's happening. It's gotten so bad, and I think almost every journalist at Vox has gotten some sort of this kind of threats to their safety. It's horrifying. What we do is we really train editors, producers, managers on how to look for warning signs, how to make sure there are systems in place to share those warning signs. We have a Slack channel for all of Vox Media where people can give in complaints. There's someone in charge of this program and who responds right away and monitors the activity and makes sure all the information is scrubbed from the internet so someone feels safe, because a lot of these threats are happening on social media. But I think we all have to be really aware, and I make sure that all managers of all levels and writers and hosts all are aware of the threats and know how to watch out for them. But we take them very, very seriously and have a whole system in place. And I think the Times and other places all have something like this in effect, because it is a real crisis that we've all been experiencing.
Yeah, and it's getting worse. I've been going to Trump rallies for 6 years. And I wouldn't even say this is Trump specific, but you can feel the energy feel more feral. I was like, I've seen people sped on. I have go back to Africa's. I was at North Carolina when they did the Send Her Back with Ilhan Omar and AOC, and that was a thing that I've never seen before. And there's also more individual instances, right? Like I also do stuff where I go to people's houses. I will, and you feel the tension, I guess the corporate answer is like they have taken it way more seriously. We have mandatory trainings. We have a lot more direct communication of what, like before, it was just go, like when I started journalism, it was just go and come back hopefully alive. And like now they know where you are, they're communicating with you, it's much more intense, but I think it has to be. But the internet stuff is crazy. Like I've had fake accounts. I've had people call old people in my life. I mean, my dad has the same name as me. Like there was a swatting thing at my dad's church. I mean, like there is a level of foolishness that is, there's no amount of corporate planning ahead can stop, but it's helpful to have that support. And I do think it's necessary. So.
Thank you. And Garrett, maybe you could take the question about the kind of competing competing urges within news organizations and how that was reflected.
I think part of the challenge for me with the Ronna McDaniel story is like, this very quickly became a, well, they're not gonna, MSNBC is liberal and doesn't want to hire Republicans. And two of MSNBC's three biggest stars are former Republican Congressman Joe Scarborough and former Bush Communications Director Nicole Wallace. This is not a question of not platforming Republicans, not platforming conservative voices. This is not platforming people who are actively lying to viewers and participating in unsuccessful insurrections to overturn the national popular elections. To me, there should be the ability to draw some clear lines around sort of who we give voice to and how we give those voices airtime or space in our news pages. And you said this a little bit in your introduction as well, Margaret. Like, to me, part of what was interesting about NBC's decision on Ronna McDaniel was how it showed a shocking naivete to me of NBC's understanding of the basic dynamics of the Republican Party, which was, this is a woman who had just been fired by Donald Trump. And who was the constituency that she was supposed to be bringing? Who was she supposed to be representing? Who were the, as Ted said, who were the viewers she was supposed to be trying to reach?
So now
can I be a hater though?
No. Go ahead.
I do think there is uncomfort with hearing from Trump voices. Like, in that ecosystem, there is. Like, they don't, like, Nicole Wallace and Joe Scarborough are long gone and have made it very clear in public. So I don't think that hiring Ronna McDaniel as a pundit is a solution. But is there real journalistic interest in those spaces for Trump? And I think that's true of opinion pages. I think that's true of op-ed. Like, there's a lot of people who are positioned as conservative that do not reflect where that mass thing is. And I do think it is not doing us, you're not hearing Trumpism in its clearest form. So now, do we want to? I don't know. But then that's an argument for hiring Steve Bannon before Ronna McDaniel, right? Because that's actually what it sounds like.
Right.
And so for me, like, I'm not pro McDaniel pundit, but I don't think it's like some big, like, you didn't save democracy by keeping Ronna off. Like, the end.
And that seems like a great place to end because we've clearly settled everything. I just want to say that there is a reception down the hall and my panel was great. I'm very appreciative. And once again, thank you to Craig Newmark.